If things go really well for the Japanese, and let's say they manage to overthrow, British rule in India, now they get free rein to go into the Middle East.
There was a missed chance, wasn't there, for the Japanese earlier?
Yeah, I think so. In 1942, if they'd had the resources and they'd had the momentum, I think they could have continued into India.
What happens if the Japanese decide to come across the border? What happens then to the British at that point? In particular, what happens to Churchill's government? There are a number of people within the Japanese army that are looking at Mutaguchi's plan and just like, dude, you're high.
At the end of the day, the steamroller of the Americans in the Pacific is taking place right now.
That is the nightmare scenario that people like Churchill and Marshall back in Washington are looking at in the spring of 1942, that if the Axis can actually manage a physical link up here, it could just be disastrous for the larger geopolitical situation for the Allies.
Discussions around Japan's involvement in the Second World War are often limited to the Pacific and the fight between the US and the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet, in the Southeast Asian theatre, a much forgotten campaign was playing out, one that was brutal in nature and led to one of the country's worst defeats of the war. Burma was a British colony at the time, but after the invasion of 1942, Japan occupied the nation for much of the rest of the war until the Allies finally recaptured it in 1945. But could Japan have gone even further? An invasion of India in 1944 spectacularly failed, but after the hasty British retreat 2 years earlier, could the Japanese have pushed on, then to occupy the jewel in the crown of the British Empire? I'm Darryl Morris, this is Times Radio History, and welcome to another episode of History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus, don't we, on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome in history itself. Today, it's the campaign in Burma in the Second World War, over 3 years of fighting, which was ultimately a triumph for the British Indian Army. But could it have led to disaster? Should Japan have pushed on more to invade India? Was it even possible? And if so, where could we be today? These are the questions for our experts today, and joining me as ever, the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And returning to the channel once again from the US is our Pacific War favourite and scholar, the author, Jonathan Parshall. Jonathan, welcome. Chris, welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, let's start then, Jonathan, with... Well, where should we start, Jonathan? I'll let you decide where we should begin.
Sure. I'll just kick off and give us a quick overview of the Asian Pacific War for about the first 4 months, I guess I would say. So the whole Japanese plan of campaign is oriented towards the south. The reason they're going to war is because they need the oil, the rubber, and the other raw materials that are down in places like Sumatra and Indonesia. Also in Burma, where we're going to go because there's oil there as well, Malaya. And so what you see kicking off is this huge interlinked operation where Pearl Harbor happens, which is basically designed to knock the American battle fleet out of action to secure what is the eastern flank of that advance. And then meanwhile, the Japanese put troops into Malaya and into the Philippines and begin moving their air envelope southward towards Indonesia. So you see Hong Kong falling around Christmas time, 1941. Malaya is invaded immediately. Singapore is going to fall on February 15th, 1942. Java will be invaded in early March. Most of the Allied naval power will be exterminated right around that same time, end of February, beginning of March. And then the Japanese will sort of capstone, I guess, would be this big carrier raid that goes into the Indian Ocean in early April 1942 that sinks a couple British cruisers, a small carrier as well, and just raises Cain there. Sinks a lot of the merchant shipping in that area and is going to actually force the Royal Navy to retreat and rebase its forces in Mombasa, Kenya, which is a real eye-opener. But during this time, the invasion of Burma itself kicks off in January of 1942, and the Japanese push into Burma They win a battle in February at a place called the Satang Bridge, wipe out a British Indian division there, and then take Rangoon in early March of 1942, and at that point begin pushing north up country. And they're going to run into Chinese forces that are coming in because there's a critical road that runs from the town of Lashio in Burma east to Kunming, China. It's called the Burma Road, and that is the last remaining land supply link between the Allies and nationalist China. So the Chinese nationalists come in to try to defend the eastern portion of Burma, and meanwhile, William Slim's army is trying to defend the western part. The problem becomes that with the capture of Rangoon, the logistical basis for the British campaign is basically cut off at the knees because there's no good road network coming in from India. And what ends up happening is the Japanese, under the leadership of a guy named Aida Shojiro, who's a really good general, ends up just basically shellacking both of the Allied forces. They clean Slim's clocks and they kick the Chinese out as well. And at the end of that campaign, what you've got is about 60,000 dead Chinese, around 13,000 casualties for the British, and about 50,000 dead Indian civilians as well, as they're trying to get out of the country and back into Imphal. So it's a disaster for the British Empire. And that's kind of where we're at, I would say, in the April-May timeframe of 1942.
It's just absolutely brutal, Chris, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to remember that the Burmese people, by and large, welcomed the Japanese. They didn't like imperial rule much. You've got some hill people up to the north and northwest. They're called the Kashins, the Karens and people like that, the Chins. They're pretty pro-British. But they stay out of it at this stage. But John's absolutely right. This is an interlinked campaign. But what's going on in China is always really important in relation to what's going on in Burma. And why the Japanese are here is they want to secure this western flank here against any interference in China coming from India. They also want to interdict this so-called Burma Road. And we've got to bear in mind the topography here. You can only get through a certain number of roads because it's mountainous here. It's right on the back of the Himalayas, very difficult indeed. So even if you fly, you're going up very high every time you go over these mountains. So very limited opportunities to do that. As John mentioned, there's oil there. There's also a huge rice production facility in Burma on which the Indian population largely relies. So does the Chinese population in the southwest here as well. So it's a huge sort of rice bowl that they can exploit. The other thing is, of course, they front onto the Indian Ocean. So that gives them options if they want to base ships in, warships in Rangoon and things like that. But just as they consolidate, if you like, their boundary in the Pacific, they're doing the same on land here. And if you look at what I'm circling here, look, you've got an outer defensive barrier here that goes all the way around these islands and into the Pacific as well. And certainly when you look at Japanese records right now, they talk about this here. The other thing they talk
Malay
about...
barrier.
Yeah, Malay barrier. And they're also talking about a corridor that comes down from Manchuria down to Burma. So they can actually split China here and actually have a supply route going up and down here that keeps their Manchurian army going as well. So Burma's critical to them in that respect. It's not just an afterthought, it's absolutely central to their strategy.
So in terms of, in particular, getting resource through that Burma road through to China, Jonathan, what sort of impact does that have in real terms?
For the nationalist government, this is a catastrophe. What you're going to see throughout the remainder of the war is that nationalist China is going to get increasingly weaker and weaker because they're just not getting any, imports coming in through that road, particularly critical military materiel. We do try to compensate by flying stuff over what's called the hump, from air bases up in Assam, India, over the Himalayas and into China. But air transport is not a great way to move heavy military equipment into a country. And so there's just a pittance coming into China. And the result is that, the nationalist government government becomes increasingly weaker as this war goes on because that road is captured.
I think the key thing, Darryl, to mention in this campaign is that the Japanese army throughout this campaign, they're very good, obviously, at jungle warfighting. The topography is important here. It's very hot. It's very humid. You've got jungle that basically infests most of the countryside. You've also got mountains and hills on both sides. And they're very well supported by air power in this campaign. And this is absolutely critical when we come on to 1944. You get a much more combined arms campaign, taking really the British by surprise. And they've got, very, very few aircraft. You've got Brewster Buffaloes, which are obsolete fighter aircraft and things like that. The Japanese are using Zeros, and they're using their conventional fighter bombers as well. Well supported in combined arms terms. And because of that, they're able to prevail very early.
And oil is very important in Burma.
Yeah. We mentioned the oil. Yeah, absolutely. Again,
there's something this feels like something that the Japanese kind of lacked at that point, wasn't it?
Well, no. I mean, they basically before before Pearl Harbor, the whole point of what was happening is they were under an extensive oil and other embargo because of what they were doing in China. And the American approach was, we want a free trade China. We want everybody to trade with China. We don't want the Japanese interfering. And of course, progressively, Japan was being sort of starved of all the mineral resources and the oil that it needed to survive as an industrial power. That's the point. Japan's an industrial power. And of course, they say this is... You see in their diplomatic correspondence, this is what is causing us to go to war. This is why we resent what the Americans are doing to us and why they strike out at the Americans in the first place. This desire for oil, for rubber, for all the other raw materials drives the whole of this campaign. It's the same with Hitler. Hitler's strategy is driven by the desire to get raw materials and oil. If you look at it, why does he go down to Stalingrad and the Caucasus? Because of the oil.
Okay.
It's things like that.
Jonathan, Chris mentions there the terrain and the sort of brutal conditions of this war. Can you help me understand how the Japanese fought that and what made them so successful in those conditions?
Well, it's kind of ironic because at the beginning of this war, they get this reputation as sort of being jungle supermen, and that really starts in the Malayan campaign. And the weird part of that is that the Japanese never really were interested in jungle combat. This is an army that is a maneuver-based army that was designed to fight the Soviets on the plains of Mongolia, okay? But what you have is an army that is really good at night operations. They have some of the best trained light infantry in the world. They are physically very hardy, and they have a studied disdain for any sort of rough country. So that skill set plays very well in the jungle too. So in Malaya, for instance, when they would run into a British Indian outfit that was kind of, camping on a road or, trying to create a position across a road, the typical Japanese drill is we're going to use one battalion to put a fixing attack into that Indian formation, keep them in place. I'm going to use another battalion to kind of work around the flank. I'm going to figure out where that flank is. And when I find that place, I'm going to hit the British in the rear or the flank with a close-up infantry attack. The Japanese loved close combat, fixed bayonets and all that stuff. They thought that was just great. And, they do that over and over and over again and just give out a hiding to the sort of road-bound Indian Army formations. So, in the terrain in Burma, they don't have any real regard for rough terrain. It's like, okay, this is a problem. It's a bummer, but we can do it. They can go over mountains. They can go through jungle. They can find native trails and use that kind of stuff. They're very good in broken country. They can do that kind of stuff.
Okay. Do we go to 1944, Chris?
Yeah.
Do we move forward? Take us there. Set the scene on what came next.
Okay, so what happens at this stage is the Japanese consolidate their power in Burma. They start exploiting the economics there, of course. They've got a fairly compliant population, as I said, so not much difficulties. What the British do at this stage is say, right, we've got a bit of a problem here, so we better start keeping this northeast frontier really reinforced. And as John mentioned earlier, you get essentially the building up of the 14th Army. It's a three-corps army, basically, and it's got 7 what we would call Indian divisions. It's got 2 British divisions, and it's also got 3 divisions of people from our African colonies. Now, when I say they're divided into those nationalities, essentially, for example, in an Indian division, you would have a brigade of British and 2 Indians, and also Gurkhas as well. So it's not entirely, if you like, an Indian division. It does have Brits in it. The key point about it is they're all officered by British or Commonwealth officers, by and large. So although the troops might be Indian or Gurkhali, So that's the key point. And when we come on to the Indian National Army later, that's the key difference between the ones being used by the Japanese and by the Allies. Now, Slim, in the period between, having learned a lot of lessons from being kicked out of Burma, and he is an interesting guy because he's learnt his trade in the Middle East. He's been in the First World War. He's been injured a couple of times, and he is a very unconventional soldier. And people said he always looked in his Gurkha hat and with his carbine on his back like a scruffy private with general's tabs, which is what he was, everybody said. Yeah. But he's a real soldier's soldier. Everybody who met him said he has a real presence. So whatever he's saying to you, you're listening to. And he says, look, we cannot possibly fight the Japanese. And one day we're going to have to invade Burma again. We're going to have to change the way we're doing things. Now, alongside him, you've got a chap called Ord Wingate. And Ord Wingate is an unconventional soldier of the First Order. And what he says is, we've got to get into Burma or behind enemy lines. We've got to infiltrate, and we've got to set up air bases within Burma, which we can operate from. And together they come up with this idea that they have defensive boxes. So to get around what John said about the way the Japanese fix a British unit or formation and then hit them in the flank, they have these all-round defensive boxes. Right. And this comes forward.
Explain that to me. What does that mean?
So a defensive box means is you actually have your troops all-round defence. Yeah. They're supported by long-range artillery, if you can get them into theatre, but more specifically, aviation support as well in terms of attack and also dropping supplies to you. And this is critical when we come to 1944. And Wingate has a series of operations within Burma against the Japanese. And the Japanese are going, well, where are these coming from? Right. They're essentially special force operations, and they are distracting the Japanese. And this keeps in their mind throughout. Meanwhile, what Slim does is said, look, we're going to have to change the way we do things. We're going to have to learn night fighting. We're going to have to be able to fight off-road. We're going to have to do offensive patrolling. I want you to feel easy with the Japanese so you can actually deal with them. And he trains them to a very high standard in that respect. And more particularly, this off-road issue, where you fight off-road, actually plays to the strengths of the British rather than actually letting the Japanese in. The other thing is they combine aviation with it. Not just in terms of aviation that provides ground support, in other words, attacking your enemy in a blitzkrieg sort of style. They're also looking at transporting troops around. So where they have a point of impact, they can reinforce it very rapidly by aviation. And we'll see later in 1944, they actually transport a whole division by air to actually go to a weak point. So all these combined arms things sound very modern. We've mentioned the word manoeuvre. The whole thing is that Slim believes in manoeuvre defence, not static defence. And these defensive boxes and the reinforcement and moving your troops and all your assets around is a key part of that. And as we come up towards 1944, he's thinking about a major assault into Burma to actually take on the Japanese, occupy ground, implement what he's said, with his three-corps army. And it's going to start off with an attack down the Arakan, which is the coastal strip, and then he's going to put people through the hills to the east as well. And at the same time, and I'm sure John will pick up the tale here, the Japanese are planning a major assault on the Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. It's called Ichigo. Yeah. And at the same time, they're planning a major assault into India, just north of Burma, called Yugo. They've always got these words for these things. And their intention there is to neutralise the airfields in Assam, which is the province just to the north of Burma, and also hopefully isolate elements of the 14th Army.
OK, Jonathan, go on and pick up on there. Take us into Japan's effort to do those things.
Yeah, so fast forward to 1944, the situation with the Japanese is obviously very different. They've lost a lot of battles now in the South West Pacific and the Solomon Islands. They've lost at Midway. And by the time you get to the middle of 1944 in June, July, the Americans now invade the Marianas Islands, which are going to put B-29s within bombing range of Japan. So things are going really bad for the Japanese by now. And they're sort of looking around, where can we win a victory? You know, we got to do something to try to turn the war around. So they're going to do these twin operations. Ichigo in China basically is trying to drive a land corridor for their army all the way down into Southeast Asia, because one of the problems they've got is a lot of their cargo ships are getting sunk by our submarines, which means they can't move supplies over water down to places like Malaya and Burma anymore. So we're going to build a land corridor. So they kicked that off in April of 44, and it's going to do terrible damage to the nationalist Chinese. But then the other thing they want to do is win a big victory in India. And so there's this guy, Renya Mudaguchi is his name. And this dude has delusions of grandeur, I got to say. He is convinced that it is his personal destiny to lead this tremendous offensive into India that is going to put paid to William Slim's army. And as Chris says, they're going to capture the air bases in Assam and cut the Chinese off completely and blah, blah, blah. He's delusional, I think, from a logistical standpoint, but nevertheless, he manages to convince his boss, a guy named Kawabe, who is the head of the Burma area army, that Mudaguchi is going to get the green light to launch this offensive into Imphal and Kohima. And yes, as Chris says, just at the moment that Slim is preparing to push into Burma, the Japanese are preparing to push out of Burma and into Imphal with a force of about 4 divisions. And that sets up what is going to be the Battle of Imphal and Kohima.
Okay, we're going to take a closer look at that in a minute. Firstly, there was a missed chance, wasn't there, for the Japanese earlier?
Yeah, I think so. In 1942, if they'd had the resources and they'd had the momentum, I think they could have continued into India and actually taken out the problems that they were going to have to take out in 1944. I think also with the rise of Indian nationalism within India at the time, and the fact that actually they had some people on their own side, which later became the Indian National Army, they could have stimulated a widespread Indian revolt, to tell the truth, had they got into northern India at that time and essentially stimulated revolt. They had the momentum, they had the resources. Britain and its allies, including America, were totally distracted elsewhere. We hadn't got to Midway or anything by this stage. And I think probably the conditions were right for them to continue into India. I don't think they would have taken over the whole of India, but they'd have destabilised a significant portion of that very populated area in the northeast. Don't you agree, John?
I do. I think, this time in the war is the absolute nadir for British fortunes in World War II. And it's worth talking about some of the things that are going on just globally. Things are going terribly for the British in the Middle East. Rommel has kicked off an offensive that has taken back the majority of Cyrenaica, and the island of Malta is now cut off and starving. Donitz's U-boats are running rampant in the Atlantic and are sinking a lot of British tonnage. Imports into Britain are declining precipitously. The Royal Navy is on the end of just a terrible run. They lose the carrier Ark Royal in November of 1941. 2 weeks later, the battleship Barham is blown up off of Egypt. Italian frogmen disable the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria Harbor. They're just sitting in the mud there. And then, of course, at the beginning of the Malaya campaign, Prince of Wales and Repulse are sunk. So within about, 1.5 month time span, the Royal Navy's lost about a third of its battleships, if you include the earlier sinking of the Hood in there, too. So Churchill's political fortunes at this point are just in the toilet. We've just come off the largest capitulation in British history in Malaya with 138,000 troops going into captivity. It's a disaster. So if you posit that the Japanese decide that instead of facing the Americans in the Central Pacific and putting their chips into the table there, that they decide, Britain's on the ropes here. we're going to knock them out, and we're going to reorient our campaign and go big time into the Indian Ocean with the express purpose of taking away that crown jewel of the British colonies, which is India. And so there's going to be a bit of a damper, a literal damper, with the monsoon season coming in, and that's going to run from about May to September. But if you posit that the Japanese build up material and then come across the border in September, this all plays into the Quit India movement, which kicks off in August, when Nehru and Gandhi both say, we want to be independent, and that leads to riots. Churchill puts both of those gentlemen and all the top leadership of the Indian Congress Party into jail. So there's a lot of civil unrest happening here, too. What happens if the Japanese decide to come across the border and, as Chris says, maybe destabilize the eastern portion of India and maybe lead to a popular uprising that the British just can't put down? What happens then to the British at that point? In particular, what happens to Churchill's government? He could very well have been out of power, I think.
OK, that's kind of what we're going to consider shortly. So fascinating,
Yeah.
tantalising thing for us to get our teeth into. That didn't happen, though. They waited a bit longer. Let's take a closer look at what did happen. OK, let's talk about what happened next then. 1944, and the Japanese are looking to push into India from Burma. John, explain what's happening here. Take us into this crucial moment of this conflict.
Yeah. So there's basically one decent road running out of Burma into the eastern part of India that goes up over a pass and ends up running past these two towns, Kohima and Imphal. And so the basic game plan from the Japanese standpoint is that they're going to use a group of three divisions, the 33rd, 15th, and 31st, and they're going to try to surround both of those towns and cut them off from each other, and also cut off the battlefield from support from the road and railway network that is in that neck of the woods. And so these divisions start coming up both that main road, but critically too, start a cross-country movement across these very rugged hills and into India to start, infiltrating and cutting off these two towns. And Mutaguchi's hope is that once he is able to cut those towns off, wipe out the British Indian detachments that are there, that then he is going to be able to turn to the north and drive into Assam, capture those airfields that are running supplies across the hump to China, and that is going to not only destabilize India, but is also going to finally and completely cut off the nationalist Chinese, which then, in the midst of also being bludgeoned by this Ichigo offensive, will finally, hopefully, throw in the towel and come to the negotiating table. So that's sort of tactically what he's hoping to do, and strategically what he's hoping to get out of it.
OK. And OK, we'll come back to how it actually went in a moment. On the other side, Chris, things are shaping up a bit differently.
Yeah,
the British Indian Army have had the sort of chance to regroup and think strategically differently.
Yeah, I mean, Slim has got himself organised in terms of defence, but he's actually thinking about an offensive at the same time. And just as they're actually lining up to sort of do this offence all the way along here, that they get intelligence signals that actually the Japanese are on the move. So they feel they're going to have to do something about it. And they realise that the targets are likely to be Imphal, Kohima, and another place called Dimapur, which is just behind here, further, another 100 miles up this road that John mentioned. Now, at Dimapur, there's a supply base that is 11 miles by 1 mile wide. Right. It is that big, OK? So what the Japanese are saying is, look, we don't have to carry too many rations. We're only going to bring 3 weeks' rations with us. Right. OK, we're not taking a lot of our heavy equipment. We're going to capture Imphal, Kohima, and this place called Dimapur. If we can do that, we can sit on the ground, we can eat ourselves silly if we want to, and we can use that as a springboard to actually go further into India. That's the plan. So what they do on the British side is they put two divisions out in front. And what Slim calls them is the tethered goat. And what they're designed to do is attract the Japanese divisions that they know are coming up here. And they do, in fact, attract the two divisions, which meet head on at that point. Now, what they haven't seen is the other division that that the Japanese are sending around to Kohima. And to an extent, they're taken by surprise. And they fly in a brigade to stall them on the road to Kohima. And it delays them long enough to reinforce Kohima. And the whole maneuver of this campaign is the ability to reinforce and resupply Imphal and Kohima long enough to basically wear down the Japanese, because they haven't got all their supplies with them. They haven't captured any of the supplies they expected to, and also then to attack them in flank. Now, what has also distracted the Japanese is that our friend Ord Wingate and quite a substantial force of 12 brigades, in fact, of his infiltration force are operating in the north of Burma here. They've established airfields as well from which they can operate aircraft. At the same time, an American general called Stilwell, Vinegar Joe as he's known, mainly because he doesn't like the Brits very much, to tell you the truth,
He doesn't like anybody.
He doesn't like anybody, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is operating from China. He's got 6 divisions here. So while this big Japanese operation is going on in China, and we've got to see, it's nearly 500,000 men is going into this campaign, whereas you've got about 89,000 here. You've got 6 divisions that the Chinese commit to this campaign as well. So the Japanese are quite squeezed, to tell you the truth, with the Chinese coming down from this way, and you've got these divisions here. And remember, Slim has got 12 divisions. He's got 2 out in front. He's reinforcing very, very fast now to actually block everything. And you've got, as I said, the Japanese now trying to take Imphal and Kohima, not only in tactical terms, but also to survive, because they just don't have the food.
It feels like they were sort of relatively sophisticated up to this point, John. I mean, why did they, I mean, this is a massive miscalculation, is it? Why did they get this so wrong?
Well, I mean, this is actually sort of classic Japanese behavior, in that they've never been too keen on logistics. Their whole thing is, the fighting spirit, the Yamato Damashi is going to, carry us through these things. And yeah, they're counting on the fact that they're going to capture British supplies, and that's going to be good enough to keep them moving. And so, as Chris says, yeah, they're traveling very, very light. They're doing things like they're driving cattle up into the hills that they're going to slaughter up in the hills and use for food. And unfortunately, the cattle end up getting sick and falling dead in a lot of cases a lot sooner than they thought. And so, I
mean, also, John, they don't take the feed for the cattle. That's the point. So and so they're dying of starvation, incredible.
And understand, there are a number of people within the Japanese army that are looking at Mutaguchi's plan and just like, dude, you're high. Just from a logistical standpoint, this is never going to work. But Mutaguchi is convinced that the combat power of his troops and their fanaticism, if you will, is going to carry the day. He is still using mental models that were more applicable to the early war, when the Japanese in many cases attacked when they were outnumbered in places like Malaya and would beat odds of 1 to 3. That was par for the course. The war is not the same anymore. And, the Indian Army at this point is a completely different animal in terms of training and logistics and air support and all that kind of stuff. And so Mutaguchi is just not living in reality in terms of his logistical situation. And the result is that, within about 3 weeks into this campaign, the Japanese frontline units are starving.
And are the British Indian Army, are they sort of thinking differently? We considered this idea that at that point there was the sort of Indian independence movement was gaining a bit of traction. Has that sort of fizzled a bit by this point? Well,
bizarrely, the more successful the British are, the less riots you get in India. And of course, so the Japanese logic is right. If we give the British a good kicking, then we're going to see lots more of these riots and things. The other person we should mention here is a chap called Subez Chandra Bose. He basically has said to the Japanese, look, let's get all the prisoners of war who come from India. Let's get all those people who've deserted from the British side. Let's form them into troops. And they're used in this campaign as well. Right. And as I hinted earlier, they're not as good because they're not officered by the British. They're not part of the system that we use. But we shouldn't underestimate the reforms that Slim has put in place. This is a highly manoeuvre force. This is why Slim is regarded as one of the best generals of World War II. All the time, the points of weakness are being reinforced by troops being air transported around. They're having supplies dropped into them. The defensive boxes around Imphal and Kohima are basically what they put in place before, and you're getting airdrops of all sorts of things. And at a time when the Japanese are starving, their tactical choices are being made where they think the food is, not where they think they should take anything. The other thing is, John hinted at it as well, at the start of this campaign, they're thinking that the Brits, the Indians and the Gurkhas are like they were in 1942. They're not anymore. And that contempt that they have for them just doesn't pay off. The other thing is they don't think they need aviation all of a sudden. And yet on the British side, you've got US Army Air Force and you've got RAF group that is supporting all these operations, both for attack and also for transport. The other thing is they didn't believe that the British could use tanks in this terrain. And they're very surprised to find that the British are using tanks up slopes and things. And of course, that's a bit of a problem when you're just using infantry, unsupported by other elements as well.
Okay, so
some of this is, I was just going to put in quick, some of this is out of the Japanese hands too, in that it's not that they had forgotten about air power, they just don't have enough of it available at this point. You know, the correlation of forces in the air has shifted steadily throughout the the middle of the war period, to the point that both the British and the Americans in this neck of the woods are flying better aircraft with more experienced pilots, and a lot of the air power that was in this neck of the woods under the Japanese Army aviation forces has been sucked into New Guinea, and that's where the majority of the Japanese Army's air assets are now located.
Okay.
I think it's worth also stressing that the Chinese, if you've got 6 Chinese divisions on your flank, it's actually a bit difficult. Yeah. And the Chinese actually fight pretty well. I mean, you look at their performance in this, the British officers are saying, the Chinese are quite impressive, actually. And these are nationalist forces, remember. 6 nationalist divisions at a time when they're holding off this very large Japanese assault up in China itself.
Okay, so bit of hubris probably on behalf of the Japanese, a much more strategically sound British Indian army, the Chinese as well, as Chris points out. It fails, and the Japanese retreat in Burma too. John, just go on. Give us the sort of potted history of how that happens.
Yeah, so basically what does happen is the Japanese run out of gas. They realize that they are not going to be able to capture these towns. And now the problem is, well, okay, what do you do? Are you going to starve in place, or are you going to retreat to your own supply bases back in Burma? Mutaguchi won't order a retreat. And in fact, there's an incident where one of his divisional commanders on his own recognizance says, no way, I'm out. I'm taking my unit to the rear so that we can, get out of this situation and recover our logistics. And that's unheard of in the Japanese army. You just don't do that. But the result is going to be that this army collapses, and they do end up being forced back out of India into Burma. And it's a disaster for them. All of these divisions are basically going to be completely shot by the time they make it back. And the majority of the men are going to be left dead on the battlefield in India. It's a rout.
Right. And Burma?
Yeah, and all the way back down to, in fact, when the British come back down into Burma, they avoid, it's very interesting. It's rather like the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, where there's a fortified Japanese place like Mandalay or something. They simply go around it and say, let them wither on the vine, let them starve themselves. And it's a much more sophisticated campaign in this respect. Combined arms, and the Japanese just cannot survive in that sort of environment. What I think is worth stressing here is just how much materiel was flown into Imphal and also Kohima to sustain it. We're talking about 19,000 tons of supplies. These are about 1 million barrels of oil flown in. And what's really interesting here is you compare this with Stalingrad and what Goering promised Hitler that he would actually do to fly in this sort of thing. This is a scale that if you'd supported it in Stalingrad, the Germans probably would have held out.
Okay.
It's astonishing. So quite extraordinary logistic effort, to tell you the truth.
Okay, that's the real history of the Burma campaign in the Second World War. Let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Okay, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone. Ask ourselves some of those long-term questions. Had Japan won in Burma and invaded India? Had that been a success, what would have happened? John, we talked about the sort of unpreparedness, the hubris, the sort of, the strategic improvements that the British Indian Army had made. In our counterfactual, can you give us a way in which the Japanese had persevered in India?
In 44, man, that's a tough call. The first thing you have to do is that you got to get rid of Mutaguchi. I would say that your counterfactual is that you're going to pluck Tomoyuki Yamashita, who is the conqueror of Malaya, out of his current duties in China, and you're going to put that guy in charge of your offensive army in 44. After that, boy, we're going to have to posit that somehow the British are not able to use air reinforcement as effectively as they end up using. Maybe there's bad weather. Maybe I don't know what's going on here, or somehow that those initial assaults by the Japanese are just more effective, and maybe they manage to grab one of these towns and take the supply bases. Maybe they get Kohima and they, dash up the road and grab Dimapur somehow. If they get Dimapur, now it's kind of game on. Now they've got the logistical basis for sustaining a campaign. And if you posit that somehow the success of the Japanese kicks off widespread unrest in the civilian population in India, maybe that ends up completely disrupting the British efforts there. What about you, Chris? Where do you come down on this?
That's key, isn't it? That's a really key point, is that if they had some successes here, how would that have filtered into the civilian population and the unrest?
Yeah, it depends what you do with these 12 divisions. They still exist. So unless you absolutely destroy them, you've actually got quite a few forces here, and you've got a reverse situation here where they're holding perhaps Kohima and Imphal. And of course, you then got the whole of the 14th Army that's left regrouping, being able to bring in other resources and saying, well, actually, we'll do the same to you now, and you're a long way from home. The basic problem in 1944 is this is a sideshow for the Japanese. They've got an awful lot going on elsewhere. And unless, as John says, you bring down a better general, and almost anybody would have been a better general, to tell you the truth, than the guy they had, but also quite a lot more resources in terms of aviation and troops. They're not getting out of Assam. It's as simple as that. What I think is really interesting is what effect this campaign has on what is going on in China. Because I think the commitment, if you look at what went on in China with the rest of the operation, the commitment of those 6 divisions down into Burma significantly weakens the Chinese nationalists in China and makes it much easier for Mao Zedong to emerge. And if you look at the way that campaign goes, it's easy to ignore it. That particular maneuver to help the British out in Burma is a real weakness that allows the Japanese to exploit the nationalists here in China to the extent that Mao Zedong, the pressure on Mao Zedong is taken off. And I think there's a direct route through from that to Mao prevailing later on.
Right, okay. But the Japanese pushing into China?
This is the Ishigo operation, of course, that's going on in parallel to this.
Yeah.
Now, John's also mentioned the monsoon. So even if they are sitting here in Assam and places like that, but my issue with this is not what's going to happen in India, it's what's going to happen in China. There's no supplies coming up if you've captured Assam and all these other places like that. And it depends whether the Japanese hold their nerve. I suspect that it said, let's hold that, okay? Let's see what happens. We'll let Subhas Chandra Bose's boys, the Indian National Army, continue in and see what they can do. But in the meantime, the main effort here is China. It is not India. It's as simple as that. And I reckon, just looking at the decisions, John, of the Army Council at this stage, you're looking at saying China's our priority here. This is great, but actually, can we really mess with this right now?
Yeah, good point there. And I do think your point is well taken, that the troops that Stilwell is leading in Burma do materially subtract from the forces in China proper that could have been resisting Ichigo. And there are parallels there with 1942 as well, when Stilwell leads another force of 6 Chinese divisions into Burma. And these are some of Chiang's best trained troops, and they end up getting annihilated there. So what you see happening there is the Americans always had this wish that the Chinese could become an offensive force in their own right and liberate themselves without, the direct contribution of American troops. And that's a pipe dream, just because nationalist China's finances and internal economy is so weakened by this point in time that the very best they can really do is just hang on, remain in being is really kind of a victory for them. And we always have this notion that they should be fighting more aggressively. If we just give them the right material, they should be able to take the war to the Japanese themselves. And it's just, it's just not capable of doing that because of the economy.
Okay, so what do the US do then in our counterfactual?
Well, I think the US continue trying to supply the Chinese in the same way that John says, to try and encourage. I mean, the key point here, of course, if the Japanese are sitting here, of course, Calcutta's quite close in relative terms, so it's influencing that. But more importantly, you're not going to be driving down here after you've given this space here. It's going to take you forever to build up again the sort of resources you need to come down into Burma. So you're not going to really sort of distract the Japanese in that direction while other things are going on in China. But at the end of the day, the steamroller of the Americans in the Pacific is taking place right now.
Yeah, go on. Help me understand what else is going on in the Pacific.
So, you've got the Americans, they're capturing the Marianas. They're going to start to bomb the Japanese mainland. They're operating from China, of course, with all their aircraft as well. And essentially, the noose is tightening. Japan is they're islands. They're eventually going to succumb. And the key thing for me in World War II is this real resistance to drawing people back from China. They want to stay in Manchuria. It's incredible how much they're attracted to it. But in the Pacific right now, the Japanese are being absolutely strangled. But most of the population doesn't know that. Most of the army doesn't know what's happening out at sea. There's a huge amount of propaganda and disinformation going on. Most people think the Japanese Navy's doing really well. Yeah. And so you get reports of lots of American battleships and carriers being sunk. So there's this illusion that somehow everything can stay the same. And part of this, of course, is because it's totally ignored, the whole strategic perspective gets distorted. And as John said earlier, they're starting to pull aircraft out to go and help defend in the Pacific. And they can see that the existential threat to Japan comes from the Pacific, not from here.
So in a sense, are we sort of saying that the success in India would have been a sort of worst case scenario for them, sort of like, it's more harm than good, that really?
But what's the point? I mean, one of the things in war is, what are your political objectives? What is the political objective of dumping anything between 100 and 150,000 of your troops, which are desperately needed elsewhere, along with the logistics and supporting arms, if you're not going to do anything? You can let, Chandra Bose's Indian National Army loose there. Yeah, you can do that. But actually, I think there's enough left of 14th Army to deal with that, and actually to put a reverse line in there as well.
And presumably, though, for the Japanese, taking a bite out of the jewel of the crown of the British Empire would that be the sort of ideological, political?
It's a propaganda win, but I think
what kind of impact does it have?
It's just a flea bite. I think. Don't you think, John?
Yeah. No, I do. I think that's absolutely right. That by the time you get to 1944, the moral impact of having potentially driven India even completely out of the war is just it's far less important than it would have been in 1942. So, as Chris says, at this point in time, by the time you reach the middle of 44, it's the Americans that are putting the hurting on the Japanese. And yes, the majority of the Japanese population up until that point is not aware that things are going badly. But intriguingly, when the Marianas go down in July of 1944, that is going to lead to the downfall of Tojo's government. And the Japanese government now starts highlighting some of the sacrifices, like the mass suicide of Japanese civilians on the island of Saipan, and portraying this is the model that, good Japanese citizens need to be emulating. So I would say that a perceptive observer within the civilian population within Japan By the time you get to the fall of 1944, a lot of people are going, uh-oh, okay, things are not going well here. And certainly when the American B-29 offensive kicks off in about November of 44, and now we're dropping bombs on the Japanese home islands, a lot of people are getting the clue that the war is really not going well at this point.
Does that happen then? I mean, we're talking about Hiroshima. Does in our counterfactual, does that still happen?
Well, John and I have done this before. Yes, it does. Of course, it does. Because we've already seen that if you invade the Japanese home islands, you're probably going to get a million casualties. Amongst the local population, even more. You're going to have probably upwards of 500,000 casualties on the Allied side. You're going to have loads of other people dying in the decaying Japanese empire, dying of starvation, brutality, mass murder and things like that. The longer it goes on, the more people are going to die. And, as I always point out to people, the Russians entering the war for 2 weeks at the end against the Japanese killed more people than were killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's the Japanese saying, look, we've not only got, in fact, you hear, we discussed this before, John, the Japanese say, how many bombs do we think they've got? We think they've only got 2, so let's carry on the war. And then somebody says, well, actually, the Russians are giving us a good shellacking at the moment. And that's what really decides them to go, is the fact that the Russians are in the war and we're going to do really badly if that continues. So, yeah, I think the atomic bombs carry on.
Good episode, that, by the way. I enjoyed that. Yeah, go on, John.
Yeah. For sure. The bottom line is any given month at the end of the war, between 500 and 700,000 people are dying in Greater Asia as a whole as a result of this war. And 80% of those are Allied people, mostly civilians by and large. So from just a political standpoint, if Truman has a bomb that is capable of being dropped on Japan, there's no way that he's going to be able to come back to someone, 3 years down the road and say, well, I had this potential wonder weapon, but I decided not to use it because it was icky, and so we did an invasion and we lost 500,000 troops. Sorry. That's a non-starter. We are absolutely going to use the bomb to try to bring this war to a close as rapidly as possible. And even though someone like Truman is not fixated on the wider death and suffering that is happening throughout Asia, we, with the ability of 80 years hindsight, can look at that and say, yeah, dropping the bombs, as awful as they were, still it ripped the Band-Aid off and allowed the Japanese a face-saving opportunity to say, we cannot fight against this technological terror, we're going to throw in the towel. And that ends up saving just millions and millions of lives in Greater Asia. It's a no-brainer.
Just a slight detour, but in terms of Indian independence and Burma's eventual independence, how does our counterfactual Japan holding Burma and making successful inroads into India, how does it affect the timeline of that?
No, I think, it happens pretty quickly after the Second World War. Britain is broke at the end of the war, of course. So is America, actually. America's debt at the end of the Second World War is actually almost the same as it is now, in relative terms. And so, everybody's broke. You don't want to continue holding on to things that frankly are costing you money. The independence movement had picked up speed, and there was a lot of sympathy in Britain and in the wider dominions, in fact, for Indian independence. There was an idea that it would become a dominion like Canada, for example, or Australia or something. But in fact, it went down a different route, particularly with regard to partition with Pakistan.
Does it accelerate it, though?
No.
Or it stays on the same trajectory? It doesn't knock its trajectory particularly?
I don't think, unless the Japanese can apply the same resources to India that they did to China, you're not going to see a massive sort of takeover of India. I don't think the Indian population... you've got to also remember, they're under war conditions here. We've had the Bengal famine, out here as well. People aren't going to be predisposed to upsetting the order to the extent that loads of people die in communities and things like that. And there's an element, and you read it in the newspapers in India at the time, it's better the devil you know, to tell you the truth.
Exactly.
That's the
Bingo.
point.
And what about Burma then? If Japan hold Burma, John, what does that do to the timeline of independence there, if anything?
Great question. And I'm not a deep scholar on the Burma independence movement, but I would say that Burma has always been a very heterogeneous country in terms of its ethnic makeup, and you might well see a situation in 1946, 1947 that is akin to the one that we're seeing now, where you've got a lot of these very restive minorities that are like, the central government is not representing our interests and we're going to fight you. So I cannot see the Japanese holding on to that country, certainly, and I can't see them being capable of retarding the independence movement there. I think Chris's point to W know versus W don't, I think that's exactly what ended up happening during the historic Quit India movement, is that the Indian police forces and the Indian army made a decision internally that, we're going to put up with the British for the duration of this war. I don't really think that the Japanese are going to do us any good in terms of our own independence, because look what they've been doing throughout Asia as a whole. So we're gonna keep on the side of the British for the time being. But as soon as this war is won, all bets are off.
Yeah. One thing I think in Burma that's quite interesting is you look at Mao Zedong. He's quite interested in Burma because he's looking at the coastline, and there are some proto-communist elements in Burma as well, which he seeks to exploit. That dies in the end, but in fact, he certainly looks in that direction. And you do wonder what the counterfactual would have been if the communists hadn't been blocked off by the nationalists at that point and had been able to infiltrate Burma before it had been liberated.
Okay. Just to help us wrap up then, this is going to be one of those episodes of History Undone, isn't it, John, where we get to the end of it and we go, actually, these sliding doors didn't change a huge amount in the grand scheme of things?
Well, 42, John.
Apart from if that sliding door had happened earlier, actually, yes, that's a really good point.
But again, even in 42, what are you going to do? You're going to go in and go smash the toys, all that sort of thing. They're right at the extension here. This is the land equivalent of Guadalcanal. They're right at the limit, really. And unless they're going to put the effort from China into India, then this isn't going to happen. People underestimate the distances here. I mean, looking on here, Burma looks quite small, doesn't it? It's absolutely huge.
Yes, enormous territory. Yeah, go on, John.
Well, I was going to say, there's two potential Japanese options here in 1942. One is, as you say, a direct overland attack from Burma into India to try to foment a popular uprising. But you could potentially do that with an amphibious operation into Ceylon as well. And that is something that the Japanese war-gamed out. That if we can put an army into Ceylon and capture the air bases there, the fleet bases as well, now all of a sudden, the British have got a real problem in terms of the supply lines that are running up the eastern coast of Africa, which go to the Middle East, which are keeping 8th Army in supply in Egypt. And also, all this Lend-Lease aid from America is also going through the Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf, up to Basra, and then is being put on trains and sent north into southern Russia. So from a naval standpoint, if the Japanese are able to establish themselves in Ceylon, they can threaten those supply lines and potentially destabilize the subcontinent all at the same time. And so there's options here, I would argue, for the Japanese. And in a worst case scenario, you could even posit that if things go really well for the Japanese, and let's say they manage to overthrow British rule in India, now they get free rein to go into the Middle East. What happens if the Germans have a very successful summer offensive in southern Russia, managed to put an army across the Caucasus Mountains that comes down into the north of Persia, while the Japanese are coming up through the south of Persia and maybe capturing oil fields in places like Iraq and Saudi Arabia? Now you've got a physical link up between the Axis powers in the Middle East, which is, sort of the connective tissue of the entire British Empire. That is the nightmare scenario that people like Churchill and Marshall back in Washington are looking at in the spring of 1942, that if the Axis can actually manage a physical link up here, it could just be disastrous for the larger geopolitical situation for the Allies.
Fascinating, John. Absolutely fascinating. Listen, we're pretty much out of time. Give us your final thoughts, Chris. Go on. What have we learnt?
Yeah, I think what we're learning is that from this is the Japanese have specific objectives. There's no question about that. It's China, keep the Americans off our back. This is a bit of a sideshow. And as John pointed out, there's a bit of an ego trip by Mutaguchi, the general that leads it as well. But it is not the main point of impact. Once the maritime strategy from 1942 disappears, they're not interested in India, not really. And John, I would say to you also that if they were serious, they would have put amphibious troops into Burma. They'd have put resources into Burma around Rangoon, and they'd have combined a land attack with an air attack from the sea, I would suspect. But they didn't have the resources for that in 44. They could have done it in 42.
Yeah.
If that Indian Ocean raid had actually done that, as well as driven in, it would have severely disrupted northern India. But we've got to remember, these are big, big countries. And I think people forget the tyranny of distance in all these things. And the Japanese are really extended here. There's no question.
So I think the moral of the story is careful you miss your sliding doors, you miss your moments. They're sometimes there for you on the Olympic
and look at the scale on your map.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all we've got time for on this episode of History Undone. What a pleasure it's been to have the company of Jonathan Parshall. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been wonderful having you on the show. Dr. Chris Parry, as well as ever, thank you for joining me. We'll be back undoing history very soon. In the meantime, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to History Undone. You won't miss an episode. And you can also listen to this as a podcast as well, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for History Undone on your podcast app. Until next time, bye-bye.